Good morning. I have a lot of material, so we need to get started. Lord willing, if I get through it all, we'll finish chapter 20 today, which means next week Jesus will enter Jerusalem. And so this is what we're inching our way toward. Chapter 21, Jesus is going to enter Jerusalem, and from there, the narrative really slows down, where you have what is about a week's worth of events taking about 8 chapters to talk about. And what we see happening in particular in chapter 20 is as Jesus is getting closer and closer to Jerusalem, the allusions to the cross begin to become more intense. And we're going to see a couple of instances of that in this chapter. We've seen some instances of it leading up to this in chapter 19, and we will especially see it in this chapter. One, in the simple fact that Jesus is going to foretell his death once again. This is the third time in Matthew's gospel that he does this. He's done it 2 other times previously. This is the third and final time that he'll do it. There's also a bit of an allusion in this interaction that Jesus has with the mother of James and John, where he references the cup that he has to drink. So there's a little bit of an allusion to it in that fact as well. And so as we are getting closer to Jerusalem, really what we're getting closer to is the cross. And so that is what we see taking shape here in the rest of Matthew chapter 20. So we begin with verses 17 through 19, where Jesus foretells his death for what is now the third time. It says, "And as Jesus was going up to Jerusalem, he took the 12 disciples aside, and on the way he said to them, 'See, we are going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be delivered over to the chief priests and scribes, and they will condemn him to death, and deliver him over to the Gentiles to be mocked and flogged and crucified, and he will be raised on the third day.'" So this again is the third time that Jesus is foretelling of his death. And this is just for reference the first 2 times that he does. This one is in chapter 16, the other in chapter 17. In chapter 16, that's right after Peter makes that bold declaration, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." Then Jesus kind of begins to show them what that actually means. That's, of course, when Peter rebukes him and Jesus says, "Get behind me, Satan," and then that whole thing. And then in chapter 17, this is shortly after James and John and Peter see Jesus transfigured up on the mountain. And so he's done this already 2 other times, telling his disciples about what's going to happen to him. But this time, because this is the third and the final time, he gives more details. And another thing to keep in mind is this is now not that far off. It's not as if this is something that's going to happen a few years from now. This is imminent. It is coming closer and closer. And because of that, he gives some more details about it. And the details that he gives are pretty striking, given the fact that this is something that has not happened yet. But Jesus knows that it will happen, and he gives some pretty striking predictions about it. It's almost as if he knows exactly what's going to happen. Because he does, of course, if you couldn't tell that I was kidding. Yeah. And so, one thing to point out is Jesus is giving this prediction as they're going up to Jerusalem. One thing to mention, it's been said before, but I'll point it out. Jerusalem is an elevated city. And so no matter what direction you're coming from, whether you're coming from the north or the south or wherever, you're always going up to Jerusalem. Sometimes we talk about, because we live down in the lower part of Michigan, and you talk about going up north, right? Well, it's not up in that sense, because he's probably coming from north of Jerusalem, coming from the Galilean region. But no matter where you're coming from, when you're going to Jerusalem, you're always going up simply because of the elevation. And so that's one detail to point out. And again, as he's getting to Jerusalem, the details of this prediction become more clear. And here are some of those details. One thing to notice, I've pointed this out before, but it's worth pointing out again. Jesus refers to himself as the Son of Man. This is a messianic title coming from Daniel chapter 7. This is one of my favorite chapters in the whole Bible, Daniel chapter 7. I don't remember if I preached that chapter or not, Jim, when we did that a few years ago. I think that chapter fell on me, but I don't remember. When we alternated chapters in Daniel, some of you may remember that. but it's a favorite chapter of mine just because of the theme of it, where you have this Ancient of Days, and he's giving dominion, giving a kingdom to this Son of Man, pretty clearly speaking of the Father giving the kingdom to Jesus, his kingdom, of course, being an everlasting kingdom. And that's the messianic figure that is used in Daniel 7. It is also, in most of the Gospels, if not all of them, the favorite expression that Jesus uses to refer to himself. In Matthew alone, Jesus refers to himself as the Son of Man 30 times. So that's a little more than once each chapter, because there's 28 chapters in Matthew. Sometimes it's more intensive. He might do it 3 or 4 times a chapter. He may do it 0 times in another chapter. But in Matthew's Gospel in particular, this is the title that Jesus uses the most to refer to himself, being Son of Man. So he refers to himself as the Son of Man. That's an important detail. Another detail is the fact that he says he'll be delivered to the chief priests and the scribes. He identifies the particular Jewish leaders that he's going to be delivered to. And it's interesting to think about this because for a lot of Matthew's gospel, the antagonists are usually the Pharisees and the scribes. And so the scribes are grouped in here, but it's actually the chief priests and the scribes that are going to be the ones who take Jesus. And there's an interesting parallel. That didn't animate the way I wanted it to, but it's fine. PowerPoint's not perfect. There's some pretty interesting parallels, and we'll point out a few different parallels as we go through this chapter. But there's an interesting parallel in conjunction with what is going to happen when Jesus is delivered to the chief priests and the scribes, with when the chief priests and the scribes are first introduced in Matthew's gospel. If you recall, they are first introduced in chapter 2, and chapter 2 is what I commonly call the baby-killing chapter. This is where the wise men come. They say, "Where is he who's born king of the Jews?" This, of course, terrifies Herod because he's the king of the Jews. He sees a threat to his kingdom, and he inquires of the chief priests and the scribes about where this newborn king of the Jews was to be born. And, of course, they reveal the prophecy. He's to be born in Bethlehem, the city of David, so on and so forth. And so what we see, this is the parallel. When they are first introduced in Matthew's gospel account, they collaborate with Herod in the baby killing. Now, they're not necessarily responsible for the baby killing, but they tell Herod where Jesus was to be born at, which then leads to Herod killing all of the newborns in that area that would have been born at that time. And so they collaborate with Herod in that killing going on then. Well, pretty soon they will also collaborate with Pilate, another leader, this time in the specific killing of Jesus. They're not the ones that are going to be hanging him on the cross, but they're the ones who are collaborating it. They're the ones who are planning it and orchestrating it before Pilate does ultimately give them the authorization to have it done. So that's an interesting parallel. The first time we see him and the last time we see him in Matthew's gospel, what are they doing? They're killing, or they're collaborating in killing. Another thing he says is that he'll be condemned to death, and he will be handed to the Gentiles. The Gentiles here is presumably the Romans, who will be the ones who will crucify him. He goes before Pontius Pilate. He's a Roman official. The Jews didn't necessarily have the authority to kill somebody because they were under Roman control. And so the Romans had to be the ones to approve it, and they orchestrate a way where Pilate wipes his hands of the blood. He says, "No blood's on my hands," and he delivers Jesus to be crucified. And so he'll be handed over to the Gentiles, meaning the Romans. They're the ones who will crucify him. And what this shows us is that Jesus' rejection is a total rejection. It won't just be the Jews who reject him, but it's also now these Gentiles who will be the ones who will hang him on the tree. We see also Jesus points out that he will be mocked, flogged, and crucified. These are striking details, and they're very specific. It's one thing to predict that you're going to die at a specific time, but to predict these other details that go with it is striking just because of the detail that is included in it and the preciseness of these details, predicting the manner in which he will die. He'll be mocked, he'll be flogged, he'll be beaten, whipped, scourged, the whole nine, and then eventually crucified. What this shows us is that Jesus' death, will not only be a painful one, because obviously it's painful to be crucified. They drive nails through your hands and through your feet and so on and so forth. Not only is it going to be painful, but it's going to be shameful. It's shameful in one sense that he's dying the death of a criminal, and it's a public spectacle, being hung on a cross. It's also shameful in the sense that he's mocked. They'll mockingly refer to him as the King of the Jews. They throw the title over his head. And just the manner of which it happens, in the sense that you have an innocent person, the perfect, unblemished Lamb of God, who will go to the cross.
They come up with two condemnations, the condemnation that the Jews had and the condemnation that the Gentiles had.
Yeah. So the Jews, what Brad is saying is the Jews accuse Jesus of one thing, that's why they want him killed. They're able to orchestrate a way to where the Romans will accuse him of something else. And that's ultimately how he ends up getting delivered to be crucified. One last detail on this prediction. Jesus says, in spite of all that, in spite of the embarrassment, the suffering he'll endure, he will be raised on that third day. And so the suffering that Jesus will endure will result ultimately in his glorification when God does raise him from the dead. And a passage that comes to my mind that kind of illustrates this idea is what the Apostle Paul says in Philippians chapter 2. He talks about the humility that is shown in Christ to the point of death, death even on a cross. And then what's the outcome of that? In Philippians 2 and verse 9, Paul writes, "Therefore God has highly exalted him, and has given him a name that is above every name, and every knee shall bow, and tongue confess," and so on and so forth. On the earth, under the earth, so on and so forth. And so Jesus is going to go through all this suffering, but God will raise him, and he will be glorified through all of that. So that is when Jesus foretells his death for what is the third time. Then we have an interesting interaction that Jesus has with what I like to call an overreaching mother. Some of you may have overreaching mothers, so maybe you can relate to some of this. But let's read verses 20 through 28, and let's see what this interaction is all about. It says, "Then the mother of the sons of Zebedee came up to him with her sons, and kneeling before him, she asked him for something. And he said to her, 'What do you want?' She said to him, 'Say that these two sons of mine are to sit, one at your right hand and one at your left, in your kingdom.' Jesus answered, 'You do not know what you are asking. Are you able to drink the cup that I am to drink?' They said to him, 'We are able.' He said to them, 'You will drink my cup, but to sit at my right hand and at my left is not mine to grant, but it is for those for whom it has been prepared for my Father.' And when the 10 heard it, they were indignant at the two brothers. But Jesus called them to him and said, 'You know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great ones exercise authority over them. It shall not be so among you. But whoever would be great among you must be your servant, and whoever would be first among you must be your slave. Even as the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many.'" So after this prediction, he predicts his death, the painful, grueling details of it, and then the mother of the sons of Zebedee are James and John, their mother comes and makes a request. Some wonder, because in some different gospel accounts, it's actually James and John who come and make the request. Well, in Matthew, it is the mother who makes the request. And so some wonder why their mother would make this request for them and not they themselves. Is this an overzealous or overreaching mother? Some perhaps can see that in this. Some say that these sons were so young, because we don't really know their exact age when this is transpiring. But some say they're so young that their mother is actually still over them, And so perhaps she has to ask this because she's in charge of them. Or perhaps the disciples, perhaps they realize what they want and they're too ashamed to ask for it, so they send their mom to do so. Regardless of why, their mother comes and asks this question. And Jesus, she kneels before him and she wants something. Well, Jesus asks, what do you want? Remember this question that Jesus asks her, because this is going to be important later. He says, what do you want? Well, this is what she wants. She wants for her sons, James and John, to sit to the right and to the left of Jesus in his kingdom. In other words, when Jesus is in his kingdom and he's reigning and he will be on the throne, she wants her sons to be right there beside him. And this is an interesting request because when you think about it, her sons are already insiders. They're insiders in the sense that they are already part of an intimate group with Jesus. They're part of his 12 disciples. And on top of that, they, along with Peter, make up a sort of inner circle of Jesus' disciples. They are there with Jesus in very intimate moments that the other 12 are not part of, like the Transfiguration, or like when Jesus is in the garden, which is going to come up later, and I'll actually mention that later. And so they're already insiders. They are already in a pretty good position if you're thinking along those lines. But she wants more for them, and you can assume that they want more as well based on the interaction that's going to follow. So she makes this request. She says, say that these two sons of mine are to sit, one at your right hand and one at your left in your kingdom. Well, Jesus offers a response. And his response is, you do not know what you're asking. There's the old expression, be careful what you wish for, right? Sometimes we ask for things and we don't necessarily know what that entails. Well, this is an example of that. She's asking for something. She doesn't know what that is going to entail. What she doesn't know is the cost that comes with being exalted. And we've just seen this with how Jesus has foretold his death. He's going to suffer these things. He's going to be delivered to the chief priests and the scribes. He's going to be mocked and flogged and so on. He's going to be crucified. But he will be raised on the third day. Jesus will be raised, but he has to be put to death first before he's raised. And so what we see in this is there's a high cost to being exalted, and the cost is going to be suffering. And notice also Jesus, he's talking with their mother, but then he directs the question to them, to the two sons. He says, are you, so he's addressing them specifically, are you able to drink the cup that I am to drink? There's a lot of debate about what specifically he means when he talks about the cup here. And in different contexts, it can mean different things. For example, when Jesus is instituting the Lord's Supper, he talks about this cup and so on. It's the blood of the new covenant. That's one thing in that context. And another thing, when Jesus is praying in the garden, Lord, take this cup from me, that's another context. In this context, the cup simply seems to mean his suffering in a general sense. Given what he's just talked about, the suffering that Jesus has to endure, he says, are you going to be able to drink this cup that I am to drink? Which, by the way, notice he hasn't drank it yet. He says, I am to drink it. So he asks James and John this question. He directly addresses them, and they respond in verse 23 when they say, we are able. This is kind of a theme that you see in Matthew's gospel. And it's interesting because Matthew's part of this group of 12. And so it's kind of self-defeating in a sense, which I think gives what he's writing more credibility. Because if he's biased, if he's not being truthful, he's not going to include all these things that make him and the 12 look bad. But there's a lot of things we've seen that make them look bad, and it's going to continue. Jesus is going to give the prophecy later on, the shepherd will be struck and the sheep will scatter. They say, no, we're not going to do that. Well, spoiler alert, they do. They scatter. And it reminds you also of what Peter says when Jesus foretells that he'll betray him 3 times. Peter obviously is going to deny that. But lo and behold, it happens. Well, this is kind of another instance of that. He says, are you able to drink this cup that I am to bear? They say, we're able. Well, they don't really know, again, what it is that they are committing to. Now, it's interesting, they eventually will be able to and will drink the cup that Jesus is going to bear. But at this very moment, they are not prepared to do that. And I say that based on what they do later on. They will scatter when the shepherd is struck. And so it does not seem that they are able to do it at this moment, but they eventually will. And keep in mind what's going to happen in chapter 26 is Jesus is praying in the garden. They say, we're able to drink this cup. They're not going to even be able to stay awake while Jesus is praying in the garden. He gives them one thing to do, stay awake and watch, and they can't even do that. Yet they say, we're able to drink this cup. They will be able to, and they eventually will, as Jesus says, but at this moment in time, they're not able to do it. So they say, we're able. Well, now Jesus responds to them, and he says, you will drink my cup. He's certain. It's not, well, you might. You could. It's not, there's no uncertainty here. He says, you will drink my cup. And this shouldn't be news to them either, because he's already said as much to them. In chapter 10, he warned them that they would suffer. Yet alone what he says in the Beatitudes, how it's a blessing to suffer for his sake, and so on and so forth. And so they've already been warned that they would suffer, that they would face persecution. And we know that this will eventually happen later on. We read in Acts chapter 12, James is going to be killed. He's going to be beheaded in Acts chapter 12. And so we have record of that in our Bibles, that James will eventually drink of this cup. Now, secular history, there's certain traditions that aren't as reliable that says that John was also martyred, but most of the more reliable history tells us that John actually lived to quite an old age and he wasn't necessarily martyred when you think of dying for the faith. But that's not to say that he didn't suffer, because he certainly did suffer. You can read in Acts the imprisonments that he and Peter went through early on there. And when John writes the Revelation, he is on the Isle of Patmos because of the gospel, and whether that means he's an exile there, as most people say, or whether he's there as a missionary, I don't know, to be honest. I'm more inclined to think he's exiled there. But regardless of that, although John was not killed because of his faith, probably, we don't know that for sure, but it doesn't seem like he was, he did still certainly drink the cup of suffering that Jesus said that he would. He did certainly suffer. He was imprisoned, he was beaten, possibly exiled to different places, and so on. So John did certainly suffer for the sake of the gospel. And so he says initially, you will drink this cup, but then he goes on to say, but to sit at my right hand and at my left is not mine to grant. That's an interesting thing. You'd think as the king, Jesus would have a say in this. But what we see, thinking, and this is along the lines of what Paul says in Philippians chapter 2, Jesus has given up his exalted status in heaven to come to earth. And what we see in that, Jesus has given that up. He didn't count equality with God something to be grasped. That's the verbiage that Paul uses there. The Father will raise him from the dead. The Father will exalt him. Therefore, it seems to me that it's not up to Jesus per se, but it's up to the Father. And that's what Jesus says here. It's up to the Father whom is going to be at the left and the right of Jesus. And keep in mind, Jesus is already at the right hand of the Father. So that kind of raises the question, can anyone really fill this position? That question is ultimately up to the Father to answer. When you think about the exalted state of God and the exalted state of Christ, I certainly don't think highly enough of myself to say I could sit there. Now, I know in Revelation it talks about the saints will reign with them in heaven and so on and so forth, but I can't imagine myself or any other person sitting at the left and the right of Jesus. I just can't picture that of myself. So as we go through this again, he says it's up for those for whom it's been prepared by my Father. And then the other 10, because there's 12 of them, the other 10 get wind of what they are asking, and it says that they become indignant at the two brothers. That means that they are really, really mad at them. They are really upset. To be indignant at someone is pretty strong feelings. And the fact that Matthew says that they're indignant, and keep in mind Matthew is part of that 10 that is indignant toward them, this gives a little bit of insight as to the motivation of the brothers as to why they would have their mother ask this question. It seems to be motivated by pride more than anything else. And when you compare that to other gospel accounts and their record of this, it sort of corroborates that point. And so they have a prideful way of thinking about this, which stands in direct contrast with what Jesus has been drawing out in these last few chapters as we've been looking at. The last shall be first, the first will be last. That's kind of I'll touch more about that at the end, but that's kind of the theme verse of this chapter, what it says in chapter 19 and verse 30, and then later in chapter 20 and verse 16. This kind of goes against what Jesus has been drawing out. And so Jesus fixes their way of thinking, as he so often does with his disciples. He points out the typical way of thinking in verse 25, where he says, "You know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great ones exercise authority over them." So if you're someone who has authority over someone else in a pagan society, as Jesus is alluding to here, they lord it over them. They exercise that authority. They like being in charge. Large and in charge, right? That sort of thing. That's typical for that world at that particular time, and it's, I would say, still pretty typical today. You may be in workplaces, and you may have bosses who like to be bosses, right? They like to exercise authority over the people under them, and so on and so forth. But Jesus says, "It shall not be so among you." It shall not be so. This is part of that sort of kingdom reversal that we see shaping out. The expectations of the way things are in the world, that's not the way it is in the kingdom. And Jesus is the pinnacle example of that, as we'll touch on at the end. It shall not be so among you. I told you earlier to pay attention to what the mother, or what Jesus says to the mother in verse 21, where he says, "What do you want?" This is going to come back into the picture here, because there's a little bit of parallelism going on here in this story. He goes on to say, "It shall not be so among you, but whoever would be great among you must be your servant, and whoever would be first among you must be your slave." The word "would," as the ESV reads it, whoever would be great, that word in the original language is the Greek word thelo, and it means will or desire or want. And so there's a little bit of wordplay going on. Whoever would, that's the Greek word thelo, whoever wants to be great must be a servant. The word there for servant is the word we get deacon from, diakonos. If you want to be great, you need to be a servant. You need to serve other people. You need to not look after your own interests, but the interests of others, as Paul is getting to in Philippians 2 when he draws on the humility of Jesus. And those who would, again, the word is thelo there, whoever would be first must be a slave. And that word is doulos. It means to be under the subjection of someone else. That's the same word, thelo, that Jesus says to their mother in verse 21 when he says, "What do you want?" And so what we see shaping out here, this parallelism that we see taking shape, is a matter of what is it that you want. What they wanted was to be first in a prideful sense, to be at the right and the left of Jesus. But Jesus is showing them what they should want instead. If you want to be great, you have to be a servant. If you want to be first, you have to be a slave. Jesus is drawing out here the required attitude to be part of his kingdom. And this is, of course, the attitude that Jesus has himself, as he points out in verse 28, when he says, "Even as the Son of Man," again, there's that title, "even as the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many." So this is the way of thinking that Jesus had. He's showing them, don't think as they think. Don't think as the Gentiles do. Don't try to get this authority to lord it over other people or to exercise it. Instead, you are to be a servant. You're to be under the subjection of someone else. You're to be a slave. He came not to be served, but to serve. When you think about Jesus, we commonly refer to him, and other places of the Bible do this, as the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. And that is to say, there is no one else that is above Jesus. So if there's anyone who has ever lived who is worthy to be served, it would certainly be Jesus. And we as his disciples do serve him today in that sense. But he came not to be served, but to serve. Jesus embodies this when he washes his disciples' feet in John chapter 13. And Peter kind of picks up on the irony. You're not washing my feet, Jesus. I should be washing you. John the Baptist kind of picks up on that as well. When Jesus comes to the River Jordan to be baptized, and what does John say? You should be baptizing me. But Jesus came not to be served, but to serve. And that service, and Jesus does a lot of things. The next story is an example when he heals these two blind men that come to him. That service will ultimately be culminated in Jesus giving his life as a ransom, as he says. He didn't come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom, as a payment. That's what that word means. So then we have this next story where Jesus heals two blind men on the way to Jerusalem. This is the very last thing Jesus is going to do before he gets to Jerusalem. Some will say this seems a little out of place, but I think it fits, and we'll see why in a moment. It says, and as they went out of Jericho, this is in verse 29, a great crowd followed him. And behold, there were two blind men sitting by the roadside. And when they heard that Jesus was passing by, they cried out, Lord, have mercy on us, Son of David. The crowd rebuked them, telling them to be silent. But they cried out all the more, Lord, have mercy on us, Son of David. And stopping, Jesus called them and said, What do you want me to do for you? And they said to him, Lord, let our eyes be opened. And Jesus, in pity, touched their eyes, and immediately they recovered their sight and followed him. So they're getting closer and closer to Jerusalem. Now they've left Jericho, and so they're really close now. What this story does, thinking big picture, is it showcases Jesus' last point about service. He's come to serve, and now we have an example of Jesus actually serving people when he heals these two blind men. This is the last recorded miracle, or I should say the last healing story in Matthew. There's a summary statement that comes, I think, in chapter 21 at some point, where it simply says he healed them. But this is the last actually story in Matthew where Jesus heals people. And so this showcases his last point about service. He said he came to serve, and now we see him serving other people. But this also foreshadows his entry into Jerusalem, and I'll draw that out in a moment. And I'll also contrast the attitude of the two sons. We just saw an example of two sons, what they want. Now we have these two blind men and what they want. And it's a pretty stark contrast when you pin them against each other. So we see in verse 29 that as he's leaving Jericho, a great crowd is there. Jesus has a tendency to do this. Jesus is pretty famous at this point, pretty well known. His ministry had went on for approximately 3 years. And so as he's been getting to Jerusalem, there's now a great crowd that's there with him. Evidently, word has gotten around that Jesus is getting to Jerusalem. And word gets around to where these two blind men in verse 30, they heard that Jesus was passing by. They can't see. They're blind. That's obvious. So how would they know that Jesus is there? Well, they've heard about it. There's quite a ruckus that's going on about this. There's a great crowd that's there with Jesus. And so they hear that Jesus is passing by. And notice what they ask for. Sometimes you come across beggars and things, and they usually want money, or they want food, or they want gas, so on and so forth. Well, notice what they want. They say, Lord, have mercy on us, Son of David. Notice also how they address Jesus. They address him as Lord. I know some versions might omit that, but in my version, in the ESV, they address him as Lord, and they also address him as Son of David. That's a messianic title. So they must have some idea of who Jesus is to call him not only Lord, but also Son of David. They're not novices here. They know what's going on. They know who Jesus is, or they have a pretty good idea of it. And what we see happen here in verse 31, the crowd rebukes them. I don't know if maybe they're just sick of other versions of this account, and Mark and others, they call them beggars. And so sometimes we have a tendency to just shun people who are begging. So, quiet you, you know. This might be what's going on here. Maybe there's something else. But the crowd rebukes these two blind men in verse 31. They tell them to be silent. Ironically, they are rebuking these blind men, and this is part of the foreshadowing as to Jesus' entry into Jerusalem. They are rebuking these blind men for something they themselves will do in chapter 21 in crying out, Son of David. We read in chapter 21 and verse 9, the crowds that were there were crying out, Hosanna to the Son of David. And so what they are rebuking these two blind men of doing, they themselves are going to do later on. So it's a little ironic. And so they rebuke these men. They tell them to be quiet. But nevertheless, they persist in their crying out. And they repeat themselves in verse 31. Lord, have mercy on us, Son of David. Again, they address him as Lord. They address him as Son of David. And what they're wanting, it's not money. It's not wealth. It's not food. It's mercy. That's what they're asking for. Namely, they want to be healed. And so Jesus stops. He asks them a question in verse 32. And the question is familiar, if you've been paying attention, when he says, what do you want me to do for you? Again, that word is thelo. It's the same word that he used to the mother. It's the same word that he said to his disciples. If you would, you need to do this. It's the same word. I think Matthew is showing us something here. What do you want me to do for you? They want their eyes opened. They say in verse 33, Lord, let our eyes be open. Again, they call him Lord. And what we see is Jesus does as they ask. It says that Jesus, in pity, touched their eyes, and immediately they recovered their sight and followed him. I read this, so I might be wrong, but I think I read, this is the only time in Matthew that it mentions that Jesus had pity or compassion on a specific people. It's usually crowds that he has pity or compassion on. It's the same word. Here he has it on these two individual people. And so that's kind of interesting to point out as well. And the story, of course, ends with them following Jesus. So that is how the story ends. It's a good ending for these men. They get healed. They follow Jesus. So thinking about this chapter, well, first let's look at this story in particular. Jesus heals these two blind men. If you think this sounds a little familiar, Yogi Berra, the baseball player, he had an old expression, it's deja vu all over again. This kind of seems like it's deja vu all over again. And the reason for that is perhaps because you're thinking of chapter 9, verses 27 through 30. There's a strong parallel going on here between these two stories. In both stories, you have two blind men. In both stories, they cry out, have mercy on us, Son of David. It's verbatim, almost the same, except in chapter 20, they first begin by addressing him as Lord. And so in both stories, you have these two blind men who cry out, and again, the word cry out is used there in both cases. Have mercy on us, Son of David. It culminates with Jesus touching their eyes. He doesn't have to touch them, right? He doesn't have to even be physically present like we saw with the centurion's son in chapter 8, but he touches their eyes in both of these stories, and their eyes were opened. So when you read chapter 20 and you read chapter 9, they read almost identically in terms of the words that are used and so on and so forth. There's a few more details in chapter 20, but there is one major difference. There's something that is omitted in chapter 20 that is mentioned in chapter 9. In chapter 9 and verse 30, Jesus tells those two blind men, see that no one knows about it. Here we have again the messianic secret coming up. It's more drawn out in Mark's gospel account, but it comes up in Matthew as well. See that no one knows about it. The big idea behind the messianic secret that most people believe is the reason that Jesus would say this to other people, don't tell anyone about this, is if word spreads too quickly about Jesus doing these things, he'll be killed too quickly before the time is that he would be killed. Well, what we see is that time is now here. There's no longer a need to keep this messianic secret because Jesus' hour has come. Like we saw before, it's imminent. It is coming, and it is coming very soon. So as we look at chapter 20 as a whole, there is, and I have themes and threads, but really there's one theme through the chapter. And again, the theme verse of this, I think, is what we read in chapter 19 and verse 30, the end of that chapter. It kind of bookends with chapter 20 and verse 16. The idea that the last will be first and the first last. You remember we saw this play out in chapter 20, the first story there. There's the parable of the laborers in the vineyard. You had people who worked 1 hour, they get paid the same as those who worked 12 hours, so on and so forth. We touched on that already. What you have, we're going to work backwards, so we'll start with the most recent story of the two blind men. What you have here, you have two blind men who are outsiders. These are men who aren't really part of any group of people. They are outsiders in just about every sense of the word. And what we see is they receive mercy from the Son of David. What they wanted, notice the parallelism again with what they want. Jesus says, "What do you want me to do for you?" They wanted something that was, at that period of time especially, necessary. We have a lot of adaptations for blind people today. They didn't have those things back then. If you were blind, you sat and you begged. That's the way life was back then. They wanted something that was necessary and something that was taken for granted by most people. We take our sight for granted, big time. We take for granted that we have contacts and we have glasses that we can put on. We have reading glasses so that we can read the stuff in front of us. We take a lot of that for granted. This is something that they wanted. It's taken for granted by most people. It's something that they needed, and Jesus gave it to them. Contrast that with what I will call the haughty attitude that we see in those initial laborers, those that were first, right? Those that were hired early in the morning, that worked the full shift. We see that same attitude shown in the two sons, in James and John. They're already insiders in more ways than one. They're already disciples with Jesus. They're part of what you could call an inner circle of disciples along with Peter. And so they are first in a lot of different ways. These are insiders. And yet they wanted more than the others. And so you begin to see the contrast. Two different kinds of people and what they want, what their desire is. Well, Jesus shows what their desire should be. And he shows it not just with his speech, but he shows it in his actions. Jesus, who is first, no one is above Jesus. He is the name that is above every name. Jesus, who is first, shall make himself last in his crucifixion, so that we who are last, who have sin in our life, can be first. He gives his life as a ransom for us. And this is what his followers should want to do. Those who would be great must be your servant. Those who would be first must be your slave. So what we see taking shape here, Jesus is showing us the attitude that his disciples should have, and it's the attitude that he has, and he's going to show it when he goes to the cross. And so again, this is how I ended the class last week, and I'll end it in this way again. This is chapter 20 and verse 16 when he says, "The last will be first and the first last." We are the last who will be made first. We are sinful people. And the reason for that is because the one who is first, Jesus, makes himself last by going to the cross for us. We have about a minute left. Any questions or comments? All right, thanks.